Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Educatedcollins Snap channel. How you doing? So, as you can tell from the title, today we're going to be covering move decks. Now, why am I covering move decks? Because you guys just keep nonstop asking for move deck. I didn't know move decks were so popular. However, it's not really my favorite archetype, or really, I would say that common an archetype, at least in high level lobbies. So it's kind of interesting to see a lot of requests for it, but let's get started. Let's talk about move decks. So first things off, what is a move deck? What is the strategy of move? Well, the strategy is you play cards to gain power from being moved from one location to another, and then you just kind of play cards that allow movement. So that's Iron Fist. Heimdall is a big common play. Cloak, Doctor Strange, these cards that allow movement, and then you just run a lot of synergies that get buffed when the card is moved. So here, I do want to first talk about fair warning. Would not say classic move is in a great spot right now. It just doesn't have all the tools I think it needs to really compete with some of the other really meta decks. So if you're looking to build a move deck of your own, I would definitely go look into the build examples that I have near the end of the video. Just if you use the timestamps, you could just go straight there and really start digging around there to get an idea of how you want to build move, and then go from there. I wouldn't just say, "Oh, here's a classic deck list. Just play that, and I'll have a ton of success." That's not really what I'm trying to say here. So we do have a standard list. This just runs pretty much all the basic move archetypes here. Nothing too fancy with a deck like this. You just have the Heimdall finisher. That's about it. It's not a horrible deck, honestly. I think you could do something with this, but a lot of meta decks can really deal with this type of deck building idea. So that's why I have to add the caveat for this particular list. Maybe in like 2 months there'll be more synergies and like, oh, this list would be pretty fun if you just change one card. But for now, that's what I want to bring about. So here we're going to talk about some of the core cards. I just want to say that when it comes to core cards for this, you don't really have any that are like super duper important. But the first one I did want to talk about is Vulture. I think you see Vulture in pretty much all move archetypes because its payoff is just really good. You get +5 power every time it gets moved. This is one of the main payouts for playing movement decks, and this can usually be your biggest threat in the late game. Next card I want to talk about is Iron Fist. So I think this card is like almost considered core because it allows an early movement activation for very cheap. 1 energy to move a card to the left is just really, really nice. It also just allows you to kind of put things in weird locations, and it's just all around a pretty good card for one. So I would say this is like one of the cards you always want to think about if you're running a movement deck. If you're not running this card, I think maybe you could probably adjust your deck in some way. And the last card I want to talk about here is Heimdall, of course. Right, this card is just the main linchpin of move decks. It really is what a lot of people like to play in move decks. It triggers all of your movement cards, moves everything to the left. I do want to say that this card can be predictable, and even though it's a very strong card, that is maybe its biggest weakness in a move deck, where almost everyone's going to be thinking, oh, what does Heimdall do turn 6 if they're playing move? Now, if you're not playing move, this card can be a real game changer where people will not expect you to be having this card. So it can actually do a lot of work in non-movement decks. But in movement decks, this is the thing that pretty much everyone does. So this is something you just have to be aware of when you're playing move. So I talked about earlier but it's really hard to call any card in a movement deck core, because a lot of the successful movement decks, they don't run all the cards. You don't really see Craven in every movement deck that does well. You don't really see Dagger or anything really. You don't even need Heimdall in a good movement deck if your goal is to bait that you're going to play Heimdall and do something else. So that's why it's kind of hard to say, oh, you need to run this, you need to run that card. You really don't. As long as the deck has some movement pieces and has that game plan of, oh, I could maybe move something here or there, then I would say it's a movement deck. So because of that, there's nothing really core. You just kind of pick the pieces that you want to play with and go from there. Now, what are the main pieces of a movement deck? You have the movement creator. So these cards just allow your pieces to move, and they just let you trigger those movement cards. So they're something like Cloak, Doctor Strange, Heimdall, Iron Fist. These cards really just move your cards from one location to another. And if you don't really run these cards, you can't trigger your movement pieces, and your movement synergy cards are just not that relevant. So they're very important, very core. If you're running any movement synergy cards, you have to be running at least one of these. Next up, we do have the movement synergy cards. So these cards gain power from being moved one way or another, and they're usually the main payoffs for this type of movement deck. So you're usually thinking, okay, I want to run movement. What are my payoffs, right? It's probably going to be something like Vulture. It's probably going to be something like Dagger. It could be Iron Torch. It could be Craven. It could even be multiple man if you're using like Forge, Hulk Blaster, that kind of buff on it. So these are really the cards that just get stronger when things are moved. Sometimes locations can help you out and really make this a very strong archetype. So these are just the two main pieces of a movement deck: the movement synergy cards and the movement trigger cards. So how do we pilot move? This one I was like, how do we pilot move? How do you win with this deck? That was my thought. But with move, you're really trying to do one of two things. So the first thing you could be trying to do is trying to bait your opponent into a powerful turn 6 Heimdall. So you set up everything perfectly where they've played, into your Dagger, into your Craven, and then bam, you play Heimdall turn 6. Everything moves. You get all the synergies. Two Dagger triggers, Craven triggers, Vulture triggers. Woo! And then you get like, a 30 power Heimdall trigger. And that's one way you can win with a move deck. Now, the other way you can win with a move deck, it's subverting the expectations. Because Heimdall is so common, so popular, you can actually not do the Heimdall play and do something else powerful. And your opponent might play assuming that you're going to Heimdall, but since you don't, you might be able to win the right lane for very cheap because they're not really focusing on winning that lane, things like that. So it's really a two-prong attack: the bait of the perfect Heimdall, or the bait of the, oh, you think I'm going to Heimdall, but I'm going to do something else in the final turn that you wouldn't expect. So that's really, I would say, how you pilot this particular move archetype. Now, you got to make sure Iron Fist is getting big value. So this is one of your best cards, in my opinion, in a move deck right now. You just spend 1 mana to trigger a move card activation, trigger a Dagger, trigger a Vulture, trigger anything. It makes Miles Morales pretty cheap. You have to realistically make sure that you're getting a good proc when you're playing Iron Fist. So if you want to play it on turn 1, you hope you're hitting something that makes sense. So it's just not a card you want to waste. And I see this happen a lot with people playing move. They just play Iron Fist on 1 because it's a 1-drop, and then they'll just play like whatever, like a Nightcrawler on 2 or something. Just something that doesn't really fit the Iron Fist activation. I'm just like, well, you're throwing away something really, really important in your game piece. So just make sure you don't do that. So another thing, it's much easier for you to move your cards you've committed to another lane compared to your opponent. So let's say you do something, you play like a a 13-point vulture on the left lane, and then they do something like, let me see, Iron Man or something, where you're like, ooh, they're gonna win that lane pretty surely. Well, you have the ability to, like Doctor Strange, to the right lane or something. You have the ability to move a lot of your pieces from one way to another, whether it's Heimdall or whatever. So you can kind of contest a lane without really contesting it. You can like fight a lane, and then if you think, ooh, this lane's actually bad for me, you can say, okay, I'm gonna fight the lane to the left, let's play Heimdall. Or I'm gonna fight the lane to the right, let's play Doctor Strange or Cloak or something like that. So you have the ability to bait your opponent to fully committing a lane, spending a ton of resources there, and then say, oh, you can have it, I'll just move somewhere else. So that's something you can really utilize effectively if you're really comfortable with move decks, just allowing your opponent to bait a lane and then subverting the expectations. If you're not triggering your move card abilities, you have to be careful about staying in, right? So this deck does not have a lot of high potential if you're not triggering the movement abilities. Obviously, it's a movement deck. You'd be triggering your card's abilities. So sometimes you just see people playing down their casual cards, and then they just play the Heimdall, and they were only getting one trigger from the Heimdall. And I'm just like, your board is like 10 power average, like on each location. Why did you stay in? But you just have to make sure that you're triggering your cards with the Doctor Strange, with the Cloak, with the Iron Fist, with the Heimdall, if you want to be staying in. You have to do that if you want to compete with the meta decks. If you're going to be playing this deck, it's going to be tough if you're not getting these triggers. So don't just brainlessly say, okay, I'll just play my cards and then Heimdall, and they'll never see it. They will. So you have to make sure that you're getting triggers before you do that final turn. All right, always calculate your power with Heimdall. So a lot of people like to play Heimdall, everything to the left, stats. And they don't calculate the numbers because it is like a little bit of work to calculate the stats of Heimdall. You do have to do all the math, but you have to just see if your opponent can make an easy play to counter it, right? If they can play She-Hulk Arrow and your stats aren't enough to counter that, or if they can play Death plus other things, so your stats aren't enough to counter that, you have to make sure that you can beat the common answers, because it's so easy to be like, ooh, Heimdall will save me, without doing the math. And then if you do the math, you're like, ooh, wait, I'm 2 power short here. So that's kind of the issue. It's a card that requires a lot of thinking on the final turn, where you can catch people off guard because maybe your opponent won't do the math as well, right? And you might actually have the numbers, and you should be more familiar with the exact numbers. Things like Craven, things like Dagger, those cards can catch people off guard. So you should be more confident, like, oh, this is what the power is. And they might think, oh, wait, they're going to win by 2, but they forgot about the Craven proc. Oh, they forgot about the Dagger proc. So that kind of thing can easily happen in a game. And if you're paying attention, if you're doing the math carefully every time, you're going to get used to it. And then it's not going to be something that surprises you, and you're going to be confident with it. Like, that's the power of being comfortable with a deck. You get to know all the numbers, the base numbers, the averages, things like that, while your opponent is like, ooh, I haven't played a move deck in a long time. I forgot about the dagger, the dagger buff. I forgot about that, etc., etc. So just calculate. Like, I see so many people just play Heimdall and hope it's enough, and that's just not the way you want to play this game at the high levels. So keep that in mind. All right, now I have like 6 slides for Heimdall Pilot because I was like, ooh, what do you do? So I want to talk about just the turn 6 alternative plays, right? Something like an Iron Fist into a Dagger, into a Doctor Strange on turn 6 can be significantly more powerful than just playing a Heimdall, because most players will not expect that type of play on the final turn. Anytime you're fighting a move deck, what do you expect? Heimdall on 6, that's about it. You don't really expect anything else. So if you do anything else that kind of subverts expectations, can win, that can be a much more powerful play, because they're normally going to be playing around the Heimdall. If they're staying in, they're probably playing around the Heimdall. So if you do something that's equally powerful but isn't exactly, I move everything to my left, well, then that's how you get those 4-8 cube wins, because they think you're going to do one thing, you do something else that's also equally powerful. So that's something you always want to be keeping in mind. Can I do something else on the final turn that's very strong? That kind of thing can really get you there. Now I want to talk about some of the powerful plays of move decks. Well, there's none. No, I'm kidding. I have a couple up here. But Iron Fist into Vulture, easy 10 power. And if you move it again, right, that's an extra 5 power. You can really do a lot of work there. A nice, cool play in the early game is you play Human Torch, you play Dagger, you play Doctor Strange. With the Dagger buff, now you're going to target both cards, and you're going to move both cards to a lane. So you can really get a lot of power here. You'll get the double on the Torch. You'll get the proc on the Dagger. That's a really nice change they've done by moving everything to the same power level. And then, like your last turn, you have your Dagger, you have your Craven, and then you have the Heimdall. You move everything to the left. You can proc the Dagger, you can proc the Craven, and everything moves to the left. And you can get really big swings on the final turn like that. So that's really some of the things you want to be looking at in move decks, just making sure that you're getting consistent value, consistent power, triggering a lot of movement effects. Now I want to talk about some of the flex spots. So here we only have 2 flex spots, but that's not really true. We'll talk about it in the next slide, but these 2 are just like random cards, I would say, in a classic deck. They don't really need to be here. They do trigger your Craven, but it's not that necessary. It just allows for more movement flexibility where your opponent can't really tell exactly where all of your power is going to be allocated. You can just say, oh, they think I'm committing to this lane, but actually I'm committing to that lane. They think I'm committing here, but I'm actually committing there. So you get a lot of movement. I did not want to say that. You get a lot of flexibility in how you want to place the powers in each location. So these 2 cards just help with that. You can definitely replace these cards with different options, as we're going to talk about later, but these are just some common things in classic move. Now, flex spots, flex cards, everything I would say in the deck can be a flex card, since you don't really need any specific card to be really called a move deck. If you're playing Iron Fist and Vulture and that's it, like, you could arguably say you're playing a move deck because you have the movement cards. Same thing if you're just playing, like, I don't know, Craven Heimdall or something, that's it. Or I guess you play Iron Fist, because you play Iron Fist like everything, but Iron Fist, Craven Heimdall, like, that could be enough to just say, yeah, it's a move deck. So you don't really need to have anything core. As long as you have a couple move pieces, you can kind of call it a move deck. So because of that, almost all of your cards in your deck are pretty flexible. If you have a different build and you want to tech into move cards, that's perfectly fine, right? Doctor Strange is teched in a lot of decks. I wouldn't necessarily say only running Doctor Strange makes a move deck, but if you have like a little bit of synergy, then it's a lot easier to give yourself that move deck criteria. So in terms of flex spots, we do have a couple options. There's not that many for move deck right now, but I'm pretty sure that's going to change relatively quickly. But I do want to talk about Arrow. This is another win con. Arrow and Magneto, actually, they're both alternative win cons for move decks. Arrow is just really good in every deck in the game, actually, so this deck is no different. And then Magneto just kind of works with what you want to do. It moves your opponent's cards, which can trigger your Craven, and it's just a nice finisher that can be an alternative to Heimdall. If you don't want to actually play the Heimdall, you could play a Magneto, and that can do a lot of work. Forge, Hulk Blaster, these are kind of synergies for multiple man, where if you buff up the multiple man, then you're going to get more power every time it moves. I would say multiple man isn't really the best card to play if you don't run any buffers, because it really just clogs your board state, in my opinion. It doesn't really do that much for you. So I'd say in a lot of decks, you don't have to run multiple man unless you have some type of way to buff it. So that could be Forge, Hulk Blaster, or Location. It could be Ironheart, whatever. But if you're not buffing it, like, copying 3 power is not that good. So that would be my issue with the card at the moment. And then Shang-Chi Enchantress you can always run if the meta relies on that. I think Shang-Chi is pretty ubiquitous right now, so wouldn't be surprised if you put that in your own deck. Sunspot just a good card as well, where it just kind of solves any mana issues you may have. So definitely a solid card. You're already running some ones, so it can just slot in there. Polaris is also a move card, can trigger Craven. Not a super important card, but does kind of fit that niche. Next up, we have Absorbing Man. I do think Absorbing Man has the potential to be very good in move decks because you can copy Cloak, you can copy Doctor Strange. If you have the high roll potential, you could copy Heimdall. So there's ways to really make that Absorbing Man give you a lot of value. So I do think in the future this could be a staple card, but for right now it's not the staple, but it is something you can work with. Juggernaut, once again, you're moving your opponent's cards, could work out, especially with Kingpin. If you want to do something with that, if you're running Magneto, if you're running Arrow, if you're running Juggernaut, you could also run a Kingpin and have that kind of synergy. Captain Marvel could be a pretty cool tech card if you want to move your stuff but still have an avenue to contest like the right lane. You could say do a Heimdall right lane, and then if the Marvel isn't needed in that lane, you could go to the right lane and win that as a 14 power play. It's not that bad, so that's something you can do. Ironheart, once again, is kind of more of the Forge Hulk Blaster buffer for your multiple man. If you buff your multiple mans, like let's say you go turn 1 Iron Fist, turn 2 multiple man, turn 3 Ironheart, well, you could do some work with that. So that's something you can think about. Beast Falcon, these are pretty okay because of Iron Fist. Since Iron Fist is one of your best activators, being able to replay your Iron Fist and bounce some of your core cards multiple times is pretty powerful. So that's something you can do. Same thing with like putting the Vulture back into your hand or whatever. You can move it back to the right lane and keep moving it down. So that could work out. And then Storm, you actually don't suffer too much from having a Storm lane, since you can always move the lanes to the left. If you need to, you can easily jump into that lane last try with Heimdall. So it's definitely a playable tech card if you want to play Storm. So I don't think it's a bad option for a flex spot. Now I want to talk about core card alternatives, right? Since I don't think there's any core cards, you don't have to have any alternatives to core cards. I do think later on, once more synergy cards are added, a core might become established. But at this point, I don't really see anything that's necessary for 100% of decks, right? So sometimes I'm saying, oh, you need Lockjaw, you need Modork, you need, Arrow, Wave, blah, blah, blah. Here I was like, you don't need anything. Like, if anything, I'd say you need Iron Fist. But that's not really, it's not really a core card. But that's like the closest I think you would get to in terms of this deck right now that I would say is a core card. All right, so when should you snap? So I would say you could snap if you can subvert expectations with your final turn. So your opponent thinks you're going to play Heimdall, but you're actually going to do something completely different, right? We talked about earlier, something like Iron Fist, Daggers, Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange could be really a powerful play on the final turn because they think you've committed to one lane, but instead you're actually committing to a completely different lane. I think that could be pretty good. The ability to reach locked lanes with movement. So let's say the first location is something that allows you not to play there. Plunder Castle, whatever it is, right? You can definitely just say, okay, I can easily contest that very easily where most people cannot or most decks cannot. So might be able to, if the 3 locations are good for me, I might be able to snap into this situation. So that's something you can do. And then calculating your last turn movement place. This one is also pretty pretty common that people don't do, honestly, when I play, where they're not fully calculating exactly how much power they have. And if you know, oh, they're likely to play this, and if I do the math with the Heimdall, I'm going to have so much power here, I should be able to compete them, well, then you can definitely snap into that. And then playing around common counter. So if you think, oh, they're going to Shang-Chi your Vulture, but you have initiative and you can Heimdall into the other lane, well, then that might be a way to think about snapping. It's a little bit harder to do that as well, and your opponent can also five head you. Like if they know you're gonna Heimdall, well then they can just put the Shang-Chi in a different lane, right, and mess with you. So that one's a little bit harder to really feel confident about, but if it makes sense, then yeah, you can definitely snap. And then if you have perfect draws, locations, etc. Honestly, you could put that with every single deck, right? If every deck has perfect draw locations, stuff, you're gonna win. But I think move decks need that like little bit of oomph where some locations can be really, really good for move decks. And also if you draw perfectly in a move deck, it's also really, really good. So I'm always like surprised sometimes how much damage a move deck can do if they draw perfectly. I'm like, oh my god, they hit everything, and I'm just like, yeah, okay, I guess you win. So yeah, it definitely has a high potential cap. So this is something that you can do well with if you draw well. All right, now let's go to some of the weaknesses. So I think the main weakness is its predictability currently, where everyone knows, your payouts. Everyone knows, oh, Vulture here, Dagger here, Heimdall here. It's a pretty predictable deck, at least the classic version. So that's like the main weakness. It's hard to get those huge cube games because if you're losing, well, if the opponent's losing, they're gonna leave, right? So that's, it's like playing a Wong down, right? Like, oh, well, they have a Wong. Well, I'm not going to stay into that. So that's kind of the issue with this deck. It's also very hand dependent. You need your draws to be in the right order or you'll miss those activations, right? If you can't have a good activation for Iron Fist, that can be really bad. If you have to play your Cloak on 2 before you get any value, that could be pretty bad. So it's pretty hand dependent. Professor X in the middle as well could also just be a pretty big shutdown because it completely locks you from moving, or you can't move anywhere. So your Heimdall payoff might just become useless, and even if you win the Professor X lane, you might lose the other two because you can't do any big plays on your final turn. So that could be a pretty bad one. And then board clog. So if your opponent's playing a ton of things like Debris or Viper, right, you could definitely get into a situation where you can't move anywhere because your board is locked. So you do have to be careful about that. That's kind of why multiple man sometimes can be really bad. I don't like fully recommend the card because it very easily creates this in your own decks by itself. So you do have to be careful if you're going to play multiple man. You must have synergy. I know in the classic list I don't have synergy, but it felt wrong for me to take out multiple man in a classic list. I was like, it seems weird. So I left it in, but personally I wouldn't run multiple man right now. I just don't think it's super necessary, but it's something to think about when you're building a move deck. All right, now finally let's talk about some of the example builds. I think these are really what you want to start looking at when you're building a deck. So here we have a pretty cool list here where it's running a lot of the core move pieces. The one key thing is that there's a lot to do on turn 6 right here. There's actually a lot of options you can do. So instead of just being reliant on the Heimdall or multiple small drops, you now have Magneto, which I think just works really well in this type of deck. And you also have Arrow, which is just a really good card. So now you have 3 different options to play around. And then we have this Absorbing Man. So the Absorbing Man can copy Doctor Strange. It can copy Cloak. So that can be a really nice way of moving a lot of your pieces around. You have the Dagger, you have the Craven, you have the Vulture, you have the Torch. You have a lot of the nice payoffs for movement. And the Storm is like a cool tech card. It can work with locations since there are some locations that can mess with move. and it's also you can get into flooded locations pretty easily, so it's not really that big of a downside. So I actually like this storm deck, or not, it's not a storm deck. I like this move deck. Do I think it's gonna take out Thanos day one? Like, not really, but it might be able to compete in some circumstances and some draws, and that's really what you're looking for with this move deck. I don't think you're thinking, oh, I'm playing move because it's the best deck in the game and I'm gonna win 100% of the time. You're playing move because you like it, you like how it plays, you like how it runs. This is something I think can really stand up to some of the other meta decks in the format. Next up, I think this one is a move deck inspired by Freddie Babes, I believe. So you can probably check out his YouTube if you want like gameplay, I guess, of this particular deck list. But this is a pretty cool like tech move build. You still run the arrow, which I think just makes sense. But you're adding some cool pieces, which I think aren't really talked about in move. First of all, you have this yellow jacket. So I think yellow jacket kind of can work here because it's very easy to have empty locations with move, right? Since you can move things around so easily with cloak, with Doctor Strange, but we're not running Doctor Strange, but with cloak and Iron Fist and things like that. I guess even Polaris. You can definitely just set up this yellow jacket, and you can do something like yellow jacket Heimdall final turn. There's a lot of ways to get that sneaky 2 points. So it's definitely kind of helps with the point struggles that sometimes movement decks have. So I think it's an okay card here. Definitely makes sense, which is good, right? Then you have the Polaris. Polaris is just a good tech card. I think right now, just locking a location can be pretty good. And it's generally just a good card. It can work with Kraven, but that's sometimes hard to set up. But I think if you have this up, it's not like, the hardest thing. They just have to play their 2-drop or 1-drop in a location that's not where your Kraven is at, which is pretty easily. So it ends up being like a 3-power 7, which is pretty good. And then speaking of 3-power 7s, you have the Maximus. So this allows you to do alternative turn 6 plays, right? You can go Maximus plus maybe Iron Fist Dagger, right? That could be another turn 6 play, especially with the yellow jacket. So it's just a big swing of points that can really catch an opponent off their rhythm, since they're not going to be expecting this Maximus. And it's just a good card, honestly. I think Maximus is a little bit underrated. Maybe not underrated. It's probably rated fairly. But it's just 3 power for 7 is really strong. So if you can get that into a lot of decks without the drawback, then it makes a lot of sense. And then you have the Arrow, and you have the Spider-Man, you have the Shang-Chi, right? A lot of decks just are susceptible to Shang-Chi right now, so it makes sense to just run it if you can. So it's just a pretty relevant meta move deck answer if you want to have more tech cards, more compared to the first build where you're just trying to do your own thing and your tech card is the Storm. So I think this one can work. And then here we have another list by Freddie, right? Yeah, so he's definitely a proponent of the move, but this is like his old meta counter, I would say, and I still think it makes some sense even now. It still runs a lot of the pieces that we had before, right? We're still running the Maximus and the Polaris and the Arrow and the Shang-Chi, right? We just now have more tech power options, right? We have the Colleen Wing and the Swarm that gives you a lot of power early. We've got the Lizard for high power. We have the Cosmo to deal with the unrevealed shenanigans. We've got the Killmonger for stones, basically, and whatnot. So we just have a lot of ways to deal with the meta game in this particular deck list. And this one is pretty heavily draw dependent. You have to make sure your draws are good. But if you do have those nice games, well, then you can definitely pull off some powerful wins with a deck like this. So definitely think it still works and still can be a nice option to play with if you want to run move deck pieces, but you don't want to fully commit and be a full-fledged Heimdall move deck. And the last one we have is just like a pool 2 move deck, a pretty classic move deck. This one kind of just runs the standard Forge, Hulk Blaster, multiple man synergy, and you kind of just summon a ton of high powered multiple mans and just make sure that works. I do have a Hobgoblin. You could just definitely run Vision, but I do think in pool 2 Hobgoblin is pretty annoying. So if done correctly, you can definitely just ruin a person's day there. So this is a pretty safe, pretty standard like pool 2 move deck if you want to run it early. And I do think move deck early is actually very strong before people have all these crazy big play counters. I do think move deck has an option to take advantage of your ability to kind of play around these numbers that people are not going to do the math for early into pool 2. People don't know. They're not going to calculate everything. So you can definitely get away with that early on in the pool. So I definitely think it's something you can run if you want to early on in your Marvel Snaps life. So take a look at that, see if you want to run it. And then last thing, normally we do end it there, but I do want to talk about the future for move decks. So take a look at this. These are some of the cards that are coming into the game that are right of now data mined to have some move deck synergy. There's quite a lot of potential move deck cards being added into the game. So even though you might say a move is in a weird spot right now, they are actually aware of that. They do have a lot of move deck synergy cards being potentially added in the game in the near future. So that's just something I want to talk about for the people that love move. Like, hope change is coming. You know, eventually move will be the meta. We'll rise up. I'm not a move deck. I don't have any any fight in this, but there's definitely a lot of move deck synergy. So hopefully things change in the future, and you'll start being like, oh, he called it. You know, hey, he called the move decks the meta. But other than that, take care of yourselves. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.
Educatedcollins snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to Marvel Snap. Your skills will be